Hello again, this is Alister McGrath at Oxford University. And this is the third of a series of short presentations which are going to introduce you to the basics of Christian theology. You don't need any textbooks, I'm just going to be talking to you. And I've kept these presentations short and informal, so I hope you'll find them easy to listen to. So here's the question I want to explore in this third presentation. Where does theology get its ideas from? What are its sources? Now that's an important question. I hope you'll find the material in this presentation helpful and interesting. So throughout its long history, Christian theology has made an appeal really to three fundamental resources: the Bible, tradition, and reason. Doesn't mean it gives equal weight to each of these, but these are the three main sources theology engages. So let's look at each of them and try and get a sense of their importance and their usefulness and the kind of role that they might play in doing theology. Let's begin by thinking about the Bible, because there's a widespread agreement within Christianity that the Bible has a place of especial importance both in theological reflection but also personal devotion. And all the main Protestant confessions of faith stress the centrality of the Bible to Christian thinking. And more recently, the Second Vatican Council reaffirmed the importance of the Bible for Catholic theology and preaching. Now, as I'm sure you know, the authority of the Bible is very often linked with the idea of inspiration, the idea in some ways the words of the Bible convey the words of God. Of course, that all depends on how you interpret the Bible, and we'll talk about that later. Now, the Bible is divided into two major sections known as the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, the Old Testament is basically the Christian way of referring to a series of books regarded as being authoritative by Judaism, and sometimes known as the Hebrew Bible. And the point is, Christians may use these same books, but they read them in a different way. And that word testament needs explanation because it really means a covenant or a dispensation. And the theological framework underlying this term has two basic elements. First of all, the same God who called the people of Israel also called the Christian church. And second, a new phase in God's dealings with humanity came about in Jesus Christ. It is referred to as a new covenant or a new dispensation, and it's set out in the New Testament, which is seen as fulfilling the hopes and expectations of Israel in Christ. Now, obviously, there are lots of debates and disagreements here. For example, what is included in the Bible? I'm sure you will know that there's a debate about the group of works that are usually referred to as the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical works like the Wisdom of Solomon or the Book of Judith. And there are very good reasons for that debate. I don't think it's of enormous importance, so I don't want to worry about it too much. But the key point is that these books, though dating from the period of the Old Testament, were not originally written in the Hebrew language. And Protestants see these books as being interesting, but not of doctrinal importance, whereas Catholics regard them as part of the text of the Bible and hence important in relation to their teaching. So you need to be aware of that debate and its possible implications. Perhaps the most obvious implication of this is that Protestant and Catholic Bibles are laid out in different ways. Protestant Bibles, like the very famous King James Bible of 1611 or the New International Version, include these texts as the third section of the Bible, known as the Apocrypha. That comes from the Greek word for hidden, whereas Catholic Bibles, like the Jerusalem Bible, include them within the Old Testament section of the Bible. But I must emphasize that believing in the importance of the Bible kind of way is rather more important than this little debate about the Apocrypha. So as we've seen, the Bible is a major source of Christian theology. But you see, it's not important, it's not enough to recognize that the Bible really matters to theology. The Bible needs to be interpreted. And that's a really important point. Because sometimes differences arise within Christian theology over the meaning of a particular biblical passage. But sometimes these debates within Christian theology concern how multiple passages can best be woven together to disclose a wider picture. In other words, it's about what is the bigger picture that stands behind a group of texts. And theology really is about trying to find this bigger picture, embrace it, and live within it. So that's the Bible. It's really important, and we'll come back to that regularly in this course of lectures. Let's move on then to think about tradition, because a series of controversies in the early church really brought home how important desired tradition was. And the word tradition really comes from the Latin word traditio, which means handing over, handing down, or handing on. And of course, it's a thoroughly biblical idea. In 1 Corinthians, we find Paul reminding his readers he was handing on to them some core teachings of the Christian faith that he had himself received from other people. So the term can refer to both the action of passing teachings on to others, something that Paul insists must be done within the church, and to the body of teachings that are passed on in this way. So tradition can be understood both as a process and a body of teaching. And you probably know this already, but the Pastoral Epistles, that's 3 later New Testament letters which are much concerned with matters of church order, like 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy and Titus. These stress the importance of, and I quote, guarding the good deposit which was entrusted to you. So this is all about something being passed on to us which really matters. We need to hold on to it and to make sense of it. Now, the New Testament also uses the word tradition in a rather negative sense, meaning something like human ideas and practices which are not divinely authorized. But the main sense is that of something that's handed on, particularly handed on from the apostles. And the importance of this idea of tradition really became obvious in the controversy that broke out during the 2nd century, and it's the Gnostic Debate. The Gnostic Debate. And this centered on a number of questions, including how salvation was to be achieved, but also how certain biblical passages were to be understood. And Christian writers found themselves having to deal with some very weird interpretations of the Bible offered by Gnostic writers. So they were basing themselves on the Bible, but interpreting it in some astonishing ways. So if the Bible is authoritative, does that mean every interpretation of the Bible is equally valid? Well, no. Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the early church's greatest theologians, made it absolutely clear the question of how the Bible is to be interpreted is of enormous importance. And that means we don't just value apostolic texts, we interpret them as the apostles interpreted them before us. So for Irenaeus, what is handed down from the apostles to the church is not simply the biblical texts themselves, but a certain way of reading and understanding those texts. And so for Irenaeus, tradition is a way of guaranteeing faithfulness to the original apostolic teaching against Gnostic innovations. Gnostics, Irenaeus argued, simply interpreted the Bible according to their own taste. They failed to take the apostolic tradition seriously. Now that development actually is quite important because many scholars feel it underlies the emergence of creeds. Creeds are public authoritative statements of the basic points of the Christian faith as handed down from the apostles. And you probably know this, but in the early 5th century, Vincent of Lerins was convinced that certain doctrinal innovations were being introduced without good reason. And Vincent saw tradition as a check against radical innovation. He said, it's a rule for the interpretation of the prophets and the apostles in a way that's directed by the rule of the universal church. That was tradition. Much more needs to be said, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, but let's move on and look at the importance of reason. Now, as I'm sure you know, traditionally Christian theology has seen reason as being important but subservient to revelation. And if you look at a good theologian like Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, he argues that human reason on its own cannot hope to gain access to divine mysteries, but it could reflect on those mysteries once they have been revealed. And that's a position adopted by most Christian theologians, that reason allows us to reflect on revelation and in effect to begin to make connections, make applications. But the original ideas were given in revelation. Now, during what's often known as the Age of Reason in Western culture, say from about 1750 to 1950, this judgment was challenged. It was argued that reason was capable of deducing anything we need to know about God. So you don't need divine revelation. Reason can tell us everything that we know. At the time, that seemed eminently sensible, but today I think most people would say it's simply unsustainable. The shortcomings of that approach are just too obvious. Now, I could talk much more about that, but really I don't have time. Remember again, this is a sketch map of a complex landscape. So main sources of theology, the Bible, tradition, and reason. And I think it's helpful just to bear that in mind as we begin to think about some of the ideas we're developing. We can begin to reflect on how each of these theological resources feeds into those discussions. Now, in the next presentation, I want to move on and begin to sketch the main periods of the history of theology. I'll give you an idea of the questions that were being debated, the names I used to refer to these periods, and how they can be helpful to us today as we think about these things. Thank you so much for listening.